Thank you so much for being here. This is a really special moment, I think, for India and for us as a family. I was actually here in May briefly in Gujarat when the new election results came in, and it seems like it's just been a long journey for us. And I would like to speak a little bit about my father's work here. I know if he was here, he would be so eager to address this group because he had, from his background as a teacher, a really deep faith in young people that was not lip service. His signature work that he's best known for, The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid, he actually co-created with students. He was willing to put their faith and their insights, and I know that he really believed that it was young people who were going to drive change here. And I have never grown up here, so I just want to make that clear, but I do think that his optimism and his deep affection for India have become part of all of us, and I think this is a really special moment, like it was in the early 90s when he began this journey, especially with CII and trying to create Indian multinationals. I think it feels like that kind of a moment as well, where there's a new phase, a new generation, a new set of tasks. And so I would just like to share my point of view about why he hit on certain themes and his key messages, and what I think from halfway across the world are some really interesting opportunities for India. The last few years, there's been so much buildup. There's every aspect of Indian identity has kind of been reimagined. Even no more RS, even our monetary symbol has changed. We're talking about building Indian brands, Indian design, no longer about whether we could survive foreign competition in India. And you also see these really large-scale projects designed to include access to all Indians, like the unique ID. And for us as a family, too, it feels deeply personal. Started with helping to lead Indian companies and really culminated for us at the CII Southern region in 2012 when a bust of my father was installed. If you look at all of his work, whether in India or otherwise, there are really four major themes that keep emerging over and over again. The idea of aspirations, innovation, the idea of scale, and the idea of governance. And I think they all feel very emotionally appealing, but they're not always obvious in terms of how they fit together, why they're important, how they drive growth. And the debate that he had on his trips to India was very much a part of our lives at home. I started out in political science, and I think all of us shared our concern for uplifting people, but we had very different views of what the best way to do that was. And I think it's really the experience in coming back and forth to India and seeing the transformation here that's made me believe that even if we have the best policies in the world, and I think today we do have some really good policymakers, there is a special role for entrepreneurs and business in the transformation of society. And I would like to share some of my views on that. So we have today a very different conversation. I think, first of all, the divide between the two ideas of whether policy or business has receded quite a bit because very extreme poverty has been cut in half. We see some progress. There are vast new consumer markets, 5 billion cell phones, a lot of groups with new political freedom that they never had. And so, as a response, our understanding of what both wealth and poverty are has evolved pretty significantly. You have rising aspirations, you have much greater reach of technology, but you also have a little bit more difficult tasks because there are less defined measures of success. It's no longer about preventing a famine. You have to worry about health and well-being. We're looking at much broader measures as opposed to static ideas about income. So we understand today that the task in eliminating poverty isn't about getting a minimum number of calories, but really enabling opportunity and educations. And because of that, we understand that every single one of our challenges requires innovation. All of these things can't be done the old way, certainly not on the scale that we're talking about, whether it's co-creation, consumer experience. All of these buzzwords require all of us to do something differently. And the businessman's task is fundamentally about innovation. And I think that is what transforms market size. You can put any numbers on a whiteboard. The end of the day, even really good ideas need iterations. They need people to rethink how it's done over and over again. And business and entrepreneurs are the ones who do this and make sure that good ideas have the impact that they have. You can see that with the first clunky cell phone, even if everyone in the world could afford it, it would not have diffusion, it wouldn't have the impact. It's only when we make it in a form that consumers understand, relate to, and enjoy using that we see the potential. But even if we're just looking at impact, ideas don't have impact in a vacuum. We have to create rituals, we have to create new ways of doing things. Gandhi was great on many fronts, but the idea of independence in India did not start with him. It was at least 100 years old by the time he entered the picture. What he did was innovate a means, a set of rituals, a narrative that people latched onto, and that's how he changed the history of the world. And it's always painful for a consultant to admit, but insight really isn't enough anymore. The IT revolution has made it possible for a lot of people to see opportunities quicker, including consumers themselves. And you can always find people who can make statements, if only this could be done at this price, it would be a huge market. Well, we know that. So look at all of these simple trends that people know today. Higher divorce rates, there are dual income families, there's a co-parenting culture. You know, in the West at least, there's same-sex couples with children. What a consultant could do would be give you the exact dimensions to all of those. But that's not what really matters. We know all that, but it seems to always take us 20 years to put a diaper change facility in the men's bathroom. Entrepreneurship is about not talking about trends, but going 10 levels deeper, understanding the implications of those trends, and helping people cope. And policy tends to be much more delayed than entrepreneurs in seeing that and doing something about it. And I do think we all need to applaud and recognize the work of great NGOs and people who do good. But one thing I learned from my father is look at the data. And in the Indian case, at least, the number of NGOs has exploded. We now have, even the latest, that this guy trailed off or was silenced, but in 2009, we had this huge diffusion in the number of NGOs. People started thinking this was an alternative model. So at one point, we had 3.3 million NGOs, more than schools, more than hospitals, but it didn't really change the Human Development Index ranking of India. In fact, it had a negative impact. And in all fairness, the way that the calculation was done did change to give weight to greater inequality. I'm not blaming NGOs for that. I think we will get better even at doing charity because there are some truly innovative superstars in this space, but I don't think given the numbers of India, where you have 500 million people under the age of 25, we can count on this to be an answer on its own. We have to have the involvement of people who are involved in enterprise. And I think where these two trains of thought meet is just coming to whatever you're doing, for-profit, nonprofit, with an understanding that you're trying to design a better life. I always find the frame that helped me is to not try to solve all problems for all time, but understand it in human terms. Cinderella asked for a dress because that's the tangible she knew to ask for. But it's up to us to understand she was asking for inclusion. She was asking to be heard, to be loved. And I think whatever you're doing, you can think about it in those terms and get a lot further. And in general, across countries, the data on innovation is a lot more promising. Its role in creating prosperity stands across countries. If we look at the Global Innovation Index, which is a new index where they look at some of the inputs of innovation like institutions, human capital and research, infrastructure, as well as the outputs, the knowledge and technical, the creative stuff, online media, what you see, there's just an irrefutable link between the degree of innovation and the degree of prosperity, and it holds true across different countries. So, we can talk about jugaad, we can talk about all of those things. I think all those things are valid, but you need large-scale innovation to move large numbers of people into a better standard of living. And if you look, the top 29 countries in the world are high-income countries. There are effects of innovation unleashes in society, which I'll talk about, that make a difference. And I think all of us have to embrace the idea of doing things better, because what happens, I think, with NGOs, with a lot of these other volunteer efforts is they don't tend to be very sustainable. And if a country like India has to undertake the transformation we want, we have to match the scale of ambition of people causing problems seems to be a lot greater than the ambition level of people solving problems. And that has to change. Every time I go and talk to organizations, they're all, oh, if I only help 200 people, I'm going to be so pleased with myself. That's enough for me. That's my Guru Dakshina to this one. You know what? The people taking bribes are not sitting there saying, if only I can make life miserable for 200 people, I'm done. That's enough. I'm going to wind it up and be a good person now. We have to understand the context and the enormity of what needs to happen. But you also see that all of the other countries that have become middle income very rapidly, that have plugged into the innovation ecosystem in a major way, and they have also raised living standards. In the last 20 years, you look at people who, like Israel, Korea is an exception where they've actually gone a step further and built their own indigenous brands. You think you'd see China, Malaysia in manufacturing, Mexico, India in software. The people who have rapidly raised living standards in the past 20 years have all done it by innovating and participating in this system. It wasn't that any of these countries developed, someday woke up and discovered gold mines or oil reserves or whatever else. They all did it by changing how their society was organized. And so I think, let me give you a very quick example of why the entrepreneur's role and why the idea of innovation on its own tends to create prosperity. So we look at all of these things. I know CII, the government, many people have talked about this idea of skill building and education. And this is definitely a huge challenge for India. So let's look at a very huge variety of approaches. This is a superstar nonprofit. Akshay Patra, with midday meals, they basically said people drop out of school because they don't have enough to eat and they're earning money for food. Let's put a meal inside the school. And they've grown that simple idea, 1.3 million meals a day, 9,000 schools in 9 states, 1 billion total meals served. 1 laptop per child, many of us know about it. It's had its challenges, no question, but they also said access to information is a huge barrier. So let's create an affordable way to access information. So we have low-cost laptops. They've still done okay, 2.4 million laptops, 40 plus countries. Then they have another nonprofit like Room to Read, which basically said, let's give people access to reading material. This is a former Microsoft employee. They've built libraries and stocked it with books around the world, and they're also very high on transparency, very high performance NGO, and they actually have distributed millions of books. And when they realized some countries were so poor that they had never developed children's literature, they actually got some of the children who were educated in their schools to write books, and they've created a lot of original publications as well. And then there are the cell phone providers. Nokia definitely has had its challenges, but I think one of the really interesting apps that they created was based on a different understanding of the problem. They said a lot of people don't really take advantage of the opportunities that are available to them because they simply lack confidence. If they've had to miss a few years of school for any reason, if they just aren't really used to being in that kind of an environment, let's give people information in small bite-sized pieces. So they have a really interesting app called Learn English, which teaches people small phrases and gradually brings their skills up. And so they've actually now evolved. They've partnered with 70 content providers, and prior to 2011, for 4 out of 5 years, they were India's most trusted brand. So it just is very interesting to show that the time spent understanding people's needs and aspirations has a pretty powerful impact. But what I think is really interesting about this is that all of these solutions, none of them is a traditional schoolhouse that all of us have gone through. All of them look very different, and it's not just the solution that's different. The understanding of the underlying problem is different. And so I think this is the powerful role that entrepreneurs play. What is poverty at its very wretched, ugly core? It is a lack of choices. It's a lack of choices about where you live, what you can eat, the work you can do, and ultimately who you can be. So if entrepreneurs did absolutely nothing more than expanding the range of choices available to people, you will have a direct impact on poverty reduction. And I think that's really powerful. Nobody is asking us, even the poor, to solve all problems for all time. All of us are 10 inventions away from being at the bottom of the pyramid ourselves. Take away your phone, your laptop, your car, your clean water. All of those things were invented. We need to think, and no one of us selected any of those things because we thought it was the answer to all of our problems. We selected it because it helps us on a journey that we're determined to take anyway. And I think that's the powerful impact that business has and that policy can never have, because policymakers don't invent, they don't create. These solutions were done by people like you who just thought there had to be a better way. And I know that that was really my dad. When I look back, I admire his patience, because I used to always have this debate about, well, if you could only do this and that, and he would always very patiently say, is that what somebody else wants? And now when I look back, I think about 2 or 3 years ago in India, it did dawn on me. You know what? I've never had anybody come up to me and beg for my advice. Nobody stops in traffic and knocks on the glass and says, Deepa, what do you think about this? People ask for an opportunity, they try to sell you something, maybe they ask for money. But they're asking for choices, and they have ideas about what they want to do with their lives that need to be respected. And that listening alone is a huge opportunity for entrepreneurs. And the other thing that policymakers cannot do, that business must do, is build Indian brands. And I'm going to spend a decent amount of time talking about why I think this is really a distinct phase in countries' development. And I do think the thought process has been there in India for a long time. If you look at the Bombay store, at that time, the independence struggle was really catching fire. And people were saying, well, talking about boycotts isn't really enough. We have to give Indians who are used to a certain quality of merchandise a viable alternative. So they basically went out to all the far corners of India and said, let me source quality products to stock in this store. And they had absolutely no idea what they were going to find, but they started out with such a powerful mission. As a belief, as a concept, an ideal, Swadeshi meant awakening of the nation's collective consciousness. And they said they wanted to give people an idea of what their homeland was capable of creating. If their mission had been about product, it would have absolutely no relevance today. But I think you could probably recruit people to sign up for this in a heartbeat, even here in 2014. So that's it. But I'm going to spend a minute looking at the South Korean case. Maybe that gives us some perspective, and specifically their experience in the United States. And when Hyundai entered America 25 years ago, they basically were coming on the heels. People were still in the throes of their skepticism of Japanese cars. And they sold the lowest priced car in America. That's all they could really sell on. And the kindest review in Car and Driver said it's an acceptable alternative to a used car. And that's all they talked about, the price. But counterintuitively, they offered the best warranty in America because they knew they had to de-risk that purchase somehow. And they sold 168,000 cars in the first year. And they just kept at it. They kept shadowing people who had taken the journey with them, and they developed many concept cars that never entered the market, but they would display at car shows. So you can see it's 13 years before they develop an SUV. Then they did their first mid-size car, and their first luxury car far later, 20 years later. And in 2008, you understand where that desire to help people along starts to really pay off. When the financial crisis hit in the US, people were very insecure about buying anything, any big purchase. And all of the car industry was almost in a standstill because they were saying, well, let's offer rebates, let's offer zero money down, free gas, everything. Nothing seemed to work. These guys made a business model that said, if you buy or lease a car with Hyundai and for some reason you lose your job or have a medical emergency, we will take the car back without reporting to credit agencies. All they really did was took away the anxiety from that purchase. And it had a huge impact. They grew 14% in that year alone. And then they basically grew from there. You see that their, Genesis was voted one of the best new cars of 2009. It was at a much higher price point. They became firm competition, acknowledged competition for Ford and Japanese car makers. And they really started to then expand the offerings. And now they've been more and more audacious. They are announcing the goal of having the highest fuel economy. They were named an upward climbing brand. And ultimately, they release the Hyundai Equus, which had a luxury car price tag of $58,000. And they won multiple safety and design awards. And this is, uh-oh. There's a broken link here. I think it's on the, I have it loaded. But what they basically, I can skip this, because what they really did was install the entire owner's manual on an iPad, and they previewed this new car during the Oscars. And when people see that kind of a transformation, the country, doesn't have to go around beating its chest and talking about what it can do. You will have a seat at the table. You will have a sphere of influence. And there isn't a one-to-one relationship that I'm going to put across to you that once they did this, the country grew by this much. But what we do know is in that same period of time, there was a rapid increase in living standards, and this wasn't a single brand success. There was Samsung, LG, Face Shop, many other things. And you see that that spillover goes into popular culture as well. People talk about K-pop, Gangnam Style, Korean food, all of those things. And this is the role of brands. I think sometimes in India, people talk about brands, but they still are very skeptical. But let me relate a little bit about my experience as an immigrant. I think if there's any group of people that understands how powerful brands can be, it's us. Because I have talked to many people from many different places who have come to America, and I've asked them, how many actual Americans had you ever met before you packed your bags, left your family with no guarantee of anything? And a lot of times it's less than 5 people, if that. And what created that desire, that sense of purpose, that mission, that willingness to do that? It was interactions with American brands. 3 simple things: film, music, soft drinks, all of fashion, that whole aura. That's how powerful that narrative has been for the United States, and that's why it's so important for India. I think we actually underestimate the power that it can have. And I do think, this is the thing. Indian brands have a great start because we're suddenly starting to become more inclusive and change the life of people in India. I do think that business has one power that it should fully exploit. All of us can have things on the law books, all of us can have things on paper, but every day, whether you're rich or you're poor, anything, people have to conduct transactions. They have to buy, they have to sell, they have to trade, barter, something. If business can make those interactions more pleasant, if you can validate the individual as they go about their daily lives, that has a really powerful impact. And I know there was a lot of critique today. The first forays into the bottom of the pyramid were with cell phones and sachets, and I think now people tend to roll their eyes a little bit. But that's probably our point of view. To people who have never been validated and never been seen and never been offered anything, that's basically telling that person, hey, I see you. You're not invisible. And I think that forms a basis. That's a conversation starter that we can now take forward as India goes forward. And I always tell companies, hey, let's not get ahead of ourselves. That conversation doesn't happen in a vacuum. There is something that has to be there for people to react to. You have to say hello before you get married, most of the time. So, I think we need to keep all of these things in perspective. And I think there's so many things we can do with the gifts India has. I think my friend Abhijit Bansod makes some really interesting, he's designed all the Titan Raga watches, and he's basically taking a lot of the talent that exists in India and putting it in a modern form. This is another huge opportunity. And I think in terms of the unique sense of brand value that only India can offer, if you look at the top 100 global brands, they're all very firmly in the luxury category or in the budget mass market category. Indian companies never have had the choice to do one or the other. You have to really talk to the full spectrum in order to operate in this environment. And if you look, I think the real reason why the involvement of brands can be so powerful in India's transformation is because brands don't have the option to have two standards of behavior. The design of the Jaguar and the design of the Nano may be very different, but you can't have two sets of standards about how customers should be treated, about safety, about quality. And end of the day, even the budget car must validate my relationship with the company as a luxury car owner. So I think having this will accelerate the process of actually developing India. And also, we could be the first brands globally that have that kind of a real resonance among middle-class consumers in the global markets, as well as high-end, low-end, because that's the reality of India. It's not one thing anymore. And Indian companies have had to deal with that complexity for a lot longer than others. And bottom line, for me, if I reflect personally, the impact of this exercise has been something that's hard to put your finger on. But I remember coming back here as a kid. I don't speak any Indian language well, but even if I had, I'm not sure that I would have been able to communicate very effectively, because there was always a wall that you never felt you could penetrate between people who had and people who didn't have. And the range of experiences that we had was so much that it was hard to even start a conversation. And what I feel today is that shared goods and shared experiences and shared services create the shared experiences that allow us to speak to each other. I couldn't speak to anybody who worked in relatives' houses when I was a kid, but today we trade jokes. I mean, even without speaking the language. We talk about which phone is the better. We bitch about, cell phone calls being dropped. We talk about which, a refrigerator might be the best one. Those things were not possible 20 years ago. I remember going to my grandmother's house in Chennai when I was a kid, and the maid had brought her child to work with her because it was vacation time. My brother and I wanted to play with her because there was nobody else our age, and her mother was fine with it as well. But we couldn't play Scrabble because she didn't know English, and we couldn't talk about TV shows because they didn't have a TV, and on and on and on. And it was on the second day, my grandmother looked into her cupboard and took out a set of marbles, and we had a blast for the next 3 days. But business can introduce a lot more of those objects, and hope you'll do so. And this idea of governance that my dad hammered home, I think most people tend to view that as C.K. Prahalad being very idealistic. I don't think so. I think that is C.K. Prahalad being eminently pragmatic, the most pragmatic that he's ever been, because at the end of the day, none of us know with exact certainty which designs will take off, anything else. The countries that are prosperous, he's touched on this in India at 75, are the building block for all creativity is transparency. And you can really see this is not something that just applies to India. Prosperous countries tend to be at least more transparent. And if you look at even the experience of the United States, it was number 19 in 2012. But prior to the financial crisis, it was number 14. That 5-point slip, again, no exact one-to-one correlation, but today the United States has 1 out of 6 children living in poverty. And the only debate in town is what do we do about growing inequality in the United States? So this isn't something only India has to come to terms with. It's something that is a global issue. And the only difference I see from the first time my dad introduced this topic in India is at that time, we all seemed to believe we had to gravitate toward a more Western model. Today, all the systems have been discredited. And this is a huge opportunity for India because now the only question is who can reform fastest? Who has the guts to do it and who is going to come up with the most creative approaches. And you know what? The person who figures this out is going to have a global market because everyone's struggling with it. And let's talk a little bit about why business growth today, no matter what field you're in, truly depends on maintaining government standards. Because if we're really trying to now wow the market beyond the iPhone, the iPad, those innovation outcomes are uncertain, and it requires a huge amount of collaboration. So if you can't build trust, you're not ever going to even get a chance to play. People will not give you their best ideas. And all of these different cycles are much longer. Developing these things, figuring out the technology, the whole, post-consumer waste, all of these things are way, way more complex. So it cannot be controlled by one group, and you really need to have that. And more fundamentally, with all the promise of big data, you can't only crunch numbers and come up with great new concepts. A lot of creativity today depends on consumers themselves entrusting you with their problems, with their aspirations, telling you about what they want, the challenges they're facing, and nobody shares that information with people they don't trust. So really the ability to innovate effectively and in a way that really makes a difference does depend on building trust, and definitely co-creation is a non-starter without that. And even if you look at financial statements and outcomes, if you look at intangibles as a percentage of enterprise value, it's just been growing consistently since the 1950s. It used to be at the maximum, 30% in certain industries, but even by the year 2000, it's about 60%. All of these things like, patents, R&D, all of these things are encapsulated in this. And in countries like India, where the growth has been led by services, almost 76% of enterprise value is in intangibles. So if we don't get this right, corporate India will have an even more serious vulnerability than others. And I think this is also really saying, the quality of conduct inside and outside the firm is being reflected in financial statements. So I don't think we have to make excuses that any kind of governance is nice to have. It's pretty much a requirement today. And I also think, again, my father's really unique idea was the idea innovation can be applied to anything. And when I go to Ahmedabad and you see one of these huge Indian success stories, if you look, again, 10 levels deep, governance has been critical here too. Amul basically was trying to organize all these different cooperatives and farmers, and they basically needed a clean milk supply. So they decided to create a very unique business model where milk was paid for on the basis of its fat content, not on volume. So they didn't preach to anybody. They didn't give anybody a big lecture. But at the end of the day, they created a business model that just didn't reward corruption and manipulation. And we can talk all we want about the product portfolio and everything else. That simple business model innovation allowed them the milk supply that made all those other things possible. And I think that if we look at these things more systematically, we can find answers in many industries to address this issue. And same thing with the unique ID. I think for all its flaws, the idea of scale also in a country like India creates a degree of transparency. We know about the problems because it's been so ambitious, and we have an opportunity to fix them faster. When we do things on too small a level, the problems don't become obvious until much later, and a lot more resources are wasted. And I think the true intangible that business offers may be something that's not obvious yet. The whole point of serving people, of seeing them, of helping them along, has an intangible. If you look at even the countries that have been as historically inclusive and open as the United States, those were the signs 60 years ago. Business and government took time to say things like no colored allowed, to tell people that they didn't matter. And as people decide to innovate, the signs start to change. They start saying things like wheelchair accessible, multi-faith prayer room, think about planet Earth. And I do think that this is where my father and I finally came to see things in a similar fashion. I think we all cared about uplifting people, about doing things differently, but very few countries underwent that transformation because they all sat down one day and did deep introspection and admitted all the things they were wrong about. Hasn't happened in the history of the world. But what has happened is the countries that have set aside a goal of creating something have gradually been dragged kicking and screaming to dealing with all the reasons that they are falling behind, not treating people fairly. And when you try to innovate, what matters is ideas, not machines. You can't buy them. You have to start cultivating people. And I think that is the intangible that business offers society. And I think that's why my dad always championed these big guys, not NGOs. Our friendly neighborhood chatwala who still has ambition far beyond anything outward. And I do think that there are a few lessons from him that have always stayed with me. And I always get a little bit emotional when I'm talking about my dad, so I just want to make sure. I think one thing that I learned from him is that creating change isn't really a matter of simply offering others our suggestions. Our suggestions don't go anywhere unless we're also offering people our support. And I think that's something that we can all do no matter what, whether we're having a good day, a bad day, whether we have an idea or not. That's a culture that I think he created in our family, among the people he worked with closely. The second thing I learned from him is that with all his qualifications, he never tried to style himself as a detached analyst of India. He was always a proud and vocal evangelist for India. And every time his global audience grew, he used his platform to remind India of what it could do and remind the world of what India could do. And I got a glimpse of this last year when I went to Colombia. He gave a talk talking about all the innovations in India and Jaipur Foot, and I had a chance to visit the Mahavir Kimina Hospital, modeled on Jaipur Foot in Colombia, the only one in the country. And I met these two kids who have limbs because they heard about what was happening here. And I think that's powerful. I think people are excited to hear what's happening in India today around the world, and I think all of us need to stop apologizing and saying, yes, their problems are there, we'll fix them, these are the solutions we're cultivating, but not lose sight of the fact that, end of the day, we're judged by where we come from, and we all have a stake in making it a better place. And the last thing that I know from him is he always had this simple question: who would be better off because of this work? Whose life would change if you knew the answer? And that's why, while he tried to look at very complex problems, he always thought about the people who were impacted by his work. And I truly believe, looking back now, that the reason he so often got away with breaking rules is because he was always building people. And I think all of us as business people need to think about that. When I spoke with the doctor who treated him in the hospital, I thanked him, and he turned around and said to me, you know, one thing you learn when you're a doctor is that you can cure sometimes, but you can comfort always. That is a mindset that I think is very useful in this group. That's what's needed in a country like India that's embarking on a second wave of huge change and development. And I wish all of you the very best, and I'm very happy to take any questions.